It was past 8 in the evening. A private art museum in Manhattan was organizing a special tour, open only to invitees, unlike usual. Donald Trump was among those invited. There was no press corps or large security forces with him. Only a few special officers were watching him, standing slightly away. There was an unusual silence over Trump as he looked at the paintings hanging on the walls of the museum. It was as if he had met up with an old friend and was trying to reconnect with words. Trump was in an unusual mood that evening. Far from daily discussions and political turmoil, he was alone with the silent language of art. One of these should be in the White House, he said to himself as he looked at a thickly framed oil painting. The painting depicted a forgotten American town painted in the early 1800s. His eyes lingered on the silhouette on the horizon for a long time. "Silence," he said in a whisper. "This is it." When the museum's closing time came, the officers politely showed everyone the way out. But Trump was examining a corner prepared for historical architecture in a narrow passage leading up a small wooden staircase. The attendant next to him lost him for a brief moment, and at that moment, Trump was inside. The museum's lights began to fade slowly. Trump was sitting next to a bench without realizing it, watching the shadows of the projectors turning in his courtyard. When he raised his head, the entire hall was plunged into darkness. He stood up but heard neither the doorbell nor the attendant. He took his phone out of his pocket, but there was no signal. He winced. "They forgot me here," he said to himself. He was angry for the first few minutes. Then this anger turned into curiosity. He began to walk alone through the dark corridors of the museum. His steps echoed. The shadows of the paintings on the walls lengthened, and the dim light seeping from the rooms fell before him like old-time stories. Then he noticed a dusty inscription on a door to the left, Exhibit 14B, Open Archive, 1936. The door was half open. Trump pushed. The door creaked open. Inside were old wooden display cases, yellowed documents, and forgotten objects, a coffee table in the middle of the room, notebooks on it, a plaque hanging next to it. American Dream, Forgotten Narratives. Trump entered the room. He sat on a dusty chair. When he put his hand on one of the display cases, his fingers touched an old child's shoe. The label, Ellis Island, 1922, left by a 7-year-old immigrant child. Time stopped for a moment. Trump's face became serious. A small object had whispered a big story. "Dear viewers, sometimes a place you accidentally end up in actually takes you to the right place." Trump was not alone that night. He was talking to the shadows of the past. Have you ever listened to a whisper coming from the silence? Write it in the comments and subscribe. Because this channel tells not only what happened, but who we are. Trump slowly opened one of the notebooks. Inside were handwritten sentences on a yellowed page. "It wasn't my dream that brought me here. It was my pursuit of it. My shoes were torn, but my dream was complete." As Trump read the page, his eyes fixated on a distant point. Then he mumbled what was going through his mind. Following a dream? Maybe it was what I always had. That narrow hall was filled not only with objects, but also with the breath of the past. When Trump sat back down in the chair, every object around him seemed to whisper a silent story. He reached for an old gramophone. He turned the wind-up handle. A crackling voice of an old Italian woman was heard. He might not understand the words, but he felt the emotion the melody carried, longing, and a stubbornly carried hope. The label next to the gramophone belonged to an immigrant woman who had come from Ellis Island. It was described in just 3 words. Her name is forgotten, her music remains. Trump closed his eyes. He remembered the first apartment his father had bought him in Queens when he was a child. Similar sounds echoing down that narrow hallway coming from the radio. Back then, being big simply meant having more room. But now, being big, even a woman's forgotten name resonated. He took a deep breath. He got up slowly and walked to the window. The lights of the New York night flickered in the distance, but the dimness inside was more real. One of the display cases caught his attention. A job application was in the glass. a tattered inked note with a note underneath, "I was rejected." But I decided that day, one day my name will be on a building. Trump looked up. A small plaque sat on the display case. J.R. Mendelsohn, 1903 to 1961, born in Brooklyn. 3 years before he died, he opened a bakery that bore his name. Trump wiped the glass with his hand. A faint smile appeared on his face. Sometimes building construction began with a word written on a wall, sometimes with a rejection. My dear viewers, sometimes names don't live in history books, they only live in the margins of a notebook. Trump didn't just look back that night. He found echoes of his own story in the silent lines of others. Have you ever seen yourself in the story of someone you don't know? Write in the comments and subscribe. Because this channel tells not only what happened, but also what remains inside us. As he moved through the room, each object opened a new window in Trump's mind. A child's toy car touched him with a short note attached to it. "I played with my father once." That's the only moment I remember. Trump's eyes slowly moistened. Maybe he thought of the fast, scattered moments he spent with his own children. Maybe he thought of the few lonely but effective days he spent with his father. But something changed. In the short silence, the emotions seeping from the walls of the museum surrounded him. It was as if the entire past was telling him without speaking. He reached into his pocket. He took out a small pen and scribbled something in the notebook he carried with him. The first line was just one word: "Don't forget." For him, tonight wasn't just a museum he was locked in. It was like a mirror held up to himself. No matter how far he moved away, some things inside him were still there, and this time with no cameras, no talking, no applause. He was looking into that silent mirror. It was approaching 5 a.m. The walls of the museum were still silent, the outside world was still asleep. But inside, Donald Trump's eyes were vivid. He was now different from the man he had come to the night before. A person looking from the outside might have thought he was just sitting in a chair in front of a glass case, but someone looking inside could tell that he had begun to think quietly for the first time in years. He turned to the notebook in his hand. He added a new sentence under the first word he had written: "Remember, what we forget shapes us as much as what we build." He glanced at the cases once more. There were lives behind the dusty glass. One had vowed to establish a bakery bearing his name. One was only keeping a memory of a play he had with his father. One was continuing to exist with a song that had never been on stage. At that moment for Donald Trump, success seemed to have left his own definition for the first time. Success was no longer something measured only by the height of the towers, but also a value that could be shaped by stories that stood silently. He stood up from where he was sitting. He turned to the gramophone once more. He turned his arm. The same female voice echoed again in the museum towards morning. This time, Trump was not trying to understand that voice. He was listening to that voice, and that voice was more real than every word. At that very moment, a dim light seeped through the main door of the museum. The guards had started to enter the morning shift. The first person to enter was an old night guard with coffee mugs in their hands. He stopped in his tracks when he saw Trump in the corridor. "My God," he said softly. "Did you stay here?" Trump turned his head and adjusted his glasses. "They forgot about me, but I guess it's a good thing." The guard handed Trump coffee. There was a calm silence between them. Then the guard looked at the display windows. "You went to Exhibition 14B. Nobody goes there. Nobody looks back at those places. I was once ashamed of myself when I opened it and looked at it. It's hard to see how people are forgotten." Trump smiled. "I remember everything I have. But tonight I also understood what I don't have." The guard nodded. "Sometimes you don't find yourself in the middle of a crowd, but in the forgotten." Dear viewers, sometimes a museum doesn't just store the past, it can also echo a person's silence today. That night, Trump opened a dusty compartment inside himself, not in a display window. Have you ever revisited a forgotten exhibition in your own mind? Write in the comments and subscribe. because this channel tells not only who entered, but who left. When the museum director arrived at around 6 o'clock, he encountered an unexpected sight. Donald Trump was standing in front of the door of Exhibition Hall 14B, and before the director arrived, he had hung a small note on the wall. It was written by hand. This exhibition should not remain closed because no one should be forgotten. DT. That morning, the museum administration held an emergency meeting. Trump's proposal was clear: 14B would be reorganized, but more importantly, it would be expanded with objects that came from different cities every year, whose identities had been forgotten but whose stories remained. What would it be called? The Hall of Remembrance. A month later, the museum had a new opening. Trump came to the museum again. The press was there, but Trump didn't give a speech. He just walked into the hall. He sat on a small chair, he turned the gramophone, and he whispered, "I didn't just build walls." But that night, for the first time, I opened a window into someone's story.